She always fixes everything for us, my mother Linda announced proudly to the neighbors gathered around our kitchen table. Sheila will save the Vineyard, just like she saved Erica's boutique in that restaurant disaster. The words hit me like a slap across the face as I stood in the doorway, grocery bag still in my hands. They were talking about my money again, planning my financial future without bothering to include me in the conversation. My name is Sheila Patterson. I'm 35 years old, and I've been the family's unofficial ATM for 15 years. While my sister Erica gets praised for her entrepreneurial spirit, I'm the one who quietly writes the checks when her brilliant ideas inevitably collapse. Today, standing in my childhood home in Spokane, Washington, I watched my parents promise our neighbors that I would fund yet another one of Erica's failures. The vineyard she had been given as a graduation gift 3 years ago was hemorrhaging money, and somehow, once again, it was my responsibility to fix it. $250,000 should cover the debts and get us back on track, my father Martin continued, stirring his coffee like he was discussing the weather forecast. Sheila's always been so generous with family. She understands what's important. I set the groceries down harder than necessary, the sound echoing through the suddenly quiet kitchen. Every face turned toward me, wearing the same expectant expression I'd seen countless times before. They weren't asking if I would help. They were announcing that I already had. Growing up in the Patterson household meant understanding your place in the family hierarchy early. Erica, 3 years younger than me, had golden hair and an infectious laugh that charmed everyone she met. She was the daughter who got dance lessons, art classes, and encouragement to follow her dreams. I was the daughter who got practical advice about being responsible and realistic. When Erica wanted to start her first business at 22, our parents mortgaged their house to help her. When I wanted to pursue landscape architecture at 25, they suggested I stick with my accounting job because it was more stable. The pattern was established before I realized what was happening. Erica would chase her latest passion with enthusiasm and zero business sense. The venture would struggle because she'd spend more time planning grand opening parties than learning basic financial management. When creditors started calling, Erica would cry to our parents, who would immediately call me. "Family helps family," Martin would say, as if the help only went in one direction. "You know how hard this is for her," Linda would add, as if Erica's failures were tragedies rather than consequences. The Vineyard was supposed to be different. After her failed boutique, disastrous catering company, and short-lived yoga studio, Erica announced she was ready for something more serious. Our parents bought 20 acres of prime land near the Columbia River and gifted it to her for her 32nd birthday. "This time will be different," Linda assured me when I quietly questioned the wisdom of such an expensive gift. Erica's really committed to making this work. I watched my sister hire an expensive consultant, install elaborate irrigation systems, and plan a launch party that cost more than most people's annual salary. She called it investing in the brand. Within 18 months, the Vineyard was drowning in debt. Erica had ordered premium vines without researching what grew well in our climate. She'd hired too many seasonal workers and bought equipment she didn't know how to use. The expensive consultant turned out to be better at charging fees than growing grapes. Meanwhile, I'd been quietly saving every penny from my successful freelance accounting practice, building toward my own dreams while watching my family assume that money would always be available for their emergencies. They never asked about my goals because they never imagined I had any beyond being their safety net. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in September, when I arrived at the family house for what I thought was a casual coffee with my mother. Instead, I walked into a room full of neighbors, local business owners, and wine enthusiasts, all gathered to hear about the exciting Vineyard Revival project. Linda beamed as she explained how her older daughter would be providing the funding to transform Erica's struggling vineyard into a premier destination winery. "Sheila's always been the responsible one," she told Mr. Peterson from the hardware store. "She understands that family investment is the best investment." I stood frozen in the doorway, listening to my mother describe plans I'd never heard before. A new tasting room, expanded production facilities, marketing campaigns, and staff increases, all funded by the $250,000 they'd decided I would donate. Martin stepped forward to add technical details about soil improvement and equipment upgrades, speaking with the authority of someone who'd never grown anything more complex than tomatoes in his backyard garden. The assembled crowd nodded appreciatively, already picturing themselves attending harvest festivals and wine tastings at the Patterson family vineyard. "When will construction begin?" asked Melissa Crawford, who owned the local flower shop. "We're hoping to coordinate our fall festival with your grand reopening." Linda glanced at me with the confident smile I'd seen her use when promising things she couldn't deliver. "Sheila and Erica are still working out the final details, but we expect to break ground before winter." The assumption in her voice made my chest tighten with anger I'd been suppressing for years. They hadn't just volunteered my money. They'd committed me to a timeline and public expectations without a single conversation. Erica bounced into the room at that moment, wearing a sundress that probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. She launched into an animated description of her vision for the vineyard's future, complete with hand gestures and dramatic pauses. "My sister believes in this project as much as I do," she announced, throwing her arm around my shoulders before I could step away. "She knows how important it is to preserve family legacy." The weight of her arm felt like a chain anchoring me to obligations I'd never agreed to accept. As the neighbors filed out an hour later, chattering excitedly about wine tastings and harvest dinners, I remained silent. My parents bustled around clearing coffee cups and pastries, their movements animated by the successful performance they'd just delivered. They'd promised my money to fund Erica's recovery from her latest failure, and they'd done it publicly, making refusal seem selfish and cruel. But as I watched Erica scroll through her phone, probably planning her next expensive purchase, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time in 15 years, the word no felt not just possible, but necessary. The week following the neighborhood announcement felt like being trapped underwater. Everywhere I went in Spokane, people congratulated me on supporting family business and asked when they could visit the renovated vineyard. Mr. Thompson at the bank mentioned how wonderful it was to see siblings working together. The cashier at the grocery store said her book club was already planning a wine tasting tour. Each conversation added weight to the commitment my parents had made on my behalf, creating a web of public expectation that seemed impossible to escape. Erica, emboldened by what she perceived as guaranteed funding, began spending with renewed enthusiasm. She hired a public relations firm to develop marketing materials for the vineyard's rebirth, ordered custom labels from a boutique designer in Portland, and scheduled meetings with distributors who specialized in premium wines. When I called to discuss the financial assumptions our parents had made, she laughed off my concerns with practiced ease. "Don't worry about the details," she said, as if my life savings were minor logistics to be handled later. "The important thing is that we're finally going to have something the whole family can be proud of." But I knew the truth about Erica's track record because I'd paid for her education and failure multiple times. The boutique had closed after she spent more on interior decoration than inventory, leaving her unable to pay suppliers who'd trusted her based on family reputation. The catering company had collapsed when she booked events without calculating food costs, resulting in $1,000 losses on every wedding and corporate function. The yoga studio had lasted 6 months before landlord issues and unpaid instructors forced her to abandon the lease early. Each time, our parents had presented her failures as learning experiences while expecting me to cover the financial damage. I drove out to the vineyard that Friday afternoon to see the current state of Erica's agricultural empire. What I found was 20 acres of dying vines, broken irrigation equipment rusting in the September sun, and a barn filled with expensive machinery that hadn't been maintained properly. The soil looked depleted and cracked, suggesting Erica had never learned about proper fertilization or water management. Weeds grew between the vine rows, and several sections showed clear signs of disease that could have been prevented with basic care. The expensive consultation she'd paid for had apparently covered impressive presentations, but not practical farming knowledge. Walking through the neglected vineyard, I calculated the real cost of restoration in my head. The $250,000 my parents had promised wouldn't begin to address the fundamental problems Erica had created. The soil would need extensive rehabilitation. The irrigation system required complete replacement, and most of the vines would have to be replanted with varieties actually suited to Washington's climate. Even with unlimited funding, turning this disaster into a profitable winery would take years of dedicated work from someone who understood agriculture, business management, and wine production. Erica possessed none of those skills and had shown no interest in developing them. Standing among the dying vines, I realized my parents' announcement hadn't been about family support or business investment. It had been about avoiding the social embarrassment of admitting their golden child had failed again. They'd promised my money to maintain Erica's image and their own, sacrificing my financial security to preserve family pride. The neighbors who'd gathered in our kitchen weren't potential investors or business partners. They were an audience for a performance designed to deflect attention from Erica's incompetence. My parents had used my reputation for responsibility to guarantee funding they had no right to promise, trapping me in a commitment built on their need to avoid facing reality about their younger daughter's limitations. That evening, I sat in my apartment reviewing financial documents I'd been quietly accumulating for 3 years. While my family assumed I lived paycheck to paycheck like most single women in their 30s, I'd actually been building substantial savings through my freelance accounting practice. Corporate clients paid premium rates for discreet financial consulting, and I'd developed expertise in helping family businesses resolve exactly the kind of problems that destroyed ventures like Erica's Vineyard. My specialty was turning around failing enterprises by identifying waste, improving systems, and implementing sustainable practices. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd been helping other families solve problems while enabling my own family's dysfunction. The mountain cabin I'd been researching represented everything I wanted that my family had never encouraged me to pursue. Located 2 hours north of Spokane near Chewelah, the property included 40 acres of pristine forest, a renovated log home with solar power, and views of the Columbia River Valley that took my breath away every time I visited. The asking price was $280,000, more than my parents expected me to donate to Erica's Vineyard revival, but exactly what I needed to finally build the life I'd been dreaming about since college. My plan had been forming slowly for months as I watched Erica's Vineyard deteriorate, and my parents' denial deepen. The cabin represented independence from family obligations that had consumed my adult life. I could work remotely for my best clients while developing the landscape architecture skills I'd abandoned to be the family's financial safety net. The property included enough space for organic gardens, hiking trails, and maybe even a small workshop for furniture making, hobbies I'd never had time to explore because I was always managing someone else's crisis. But my family's public announcement had accelerated my timeline dramatically. What had been a distant dream was now an urgent necessity. I couldn't continue living in a city where everyone expected me to fund my sister's next failure, where my parents used my reputation to make commitments I'd never agreed to accept. The cabin purchase would send a clear message that my money belonged to me, that I had plans and priorities beyond serving as the family ATM. I made the call to my real estate agent that night, authorizing her to submit a full-price offer with expedited closing. The seller, an elderly couple relocating to Arizona, had been waiting for a cash buyer who could complete the transaction quickly. My agent assured me that with my pre-approval letter and earnest money deposit, we could close within 2 weeks. For the first time in months, I felt the excitement of pursuing something I wanted rather than something my family needed. The next morning brought a call from Martin demanding a meeting to finalize the Vineyard investment details. His tone carried the assumption that my participation was guaranteed, that we were simply arranging logistics rather than discussing whether I would contribute anything at all. Erica's already started the application process for the necessary permits, he informed me, as if permit fees were minor expenses rather than additional costs I'd never agreed to cover. We need to get the funding in place so construction can begin before winter weather makes outdoor work impossible. I agreed to meet with them the following Sunday, letting them believe we were gathering to sign papers and transfer money. But instead of preparing financial documents, I spent the weekend packing boxes and arranging for my most valuable possessions to be moved to a storage unit. If my family wanted to treat me like an ATM, they were about to discover that this particular machine was permanently out of service. Sunday afternoon arrived with the crisp clarity that only September in eastern Washington can deliver. I drove to my parents' house with a manila envelope containing documents that would end 15 years of financial servitude, my hands steady on the steering wheel despite the magnitude of what I was about to do. The familiar neighborhood looked different somehow, as if I was seeing it through the eyes of someone who no longer belonged there. Children played in yards while parents tended gardens, normal families living normal lives without the toxic dynamics that had defined my relationship with the Patterson clan. Martin and Linda had arranged the dining room like a business meeting, with legal pads, calculators, and financial documents spread across the table. Erica sat at the head of the table wearing a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than most people earned in a week. Her laptop opened to what appeared to be a presentation about Vineyard expansion plans. They'd prepared as if this was a board meeting, where my participation was simply a formality to be documented, rather than a decision to be made. "We've broken down the investment into phases," Linda began, sliding a typed document across the table toward me. "The first phase covers immediate debt relief and basic infrastructure repair. Phase 2 includes the new tasting room and visitor facilities. Phase 3 expands production capacity and establishes distribution partnerships." The numbers on the paper totaled far more than the original $250,000 they'd mentioned to the neighbors. Somehow, my parents had inflated their expectations while planning my financial contribution. Erica launched into her presentation with the enthusiasm of someone who'd never experienced genuine business failure. She clicked through slides showing architectural renderings of tasting rooms, marketing plans targeting wine tourists, and projected revenue streams that assumed immediate success in a notoriously difficult industry. "The consultant believes we can break even within 18 months, she announced confidently, apparently forgetting that her last consultant had led her directly into the current financial disaster. "This is really going to put the Patterson family on the map." Martin leaned forward with the serious expression he used when discussing money that wasn't his. "The timing is perfect, Sheila. Interest rates are favorable for expansion financing, and the state is offering tax incentives for agricultural development. Your initial investment will leverage additional funding that can turn this into something really substantial." He spoke as if my money was already committed, as if we were discussing implementation rather than negotiating participation. I listened to their presentation in silence, letting them build momentum with their assumptions and expectations. They painted pictures of family legacy, tourist attractions, and profitable partnerships, all funded by my savings and built on Erica's track record of spectacular failure. When they finished, the room fell quiet as they waited for my signature on documents that would transform their dreams into my financial nightmare. "That's quite a plan," I said finally, opening my manila envelope and placing my own documents on the table. "But I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding about my availability as an investor." The property deed for the cabin was printed on official county paper, with my name listed as buyer and a closing date from 3 days earlier. The purchase price was clearly visible, along with the certification that showed I'd paid cash for the entire transaction. Martin picked up the deed with confusion spreading across his face as he processed what he was reading. Linda leaned over his shoulder, her expression shifting from confident expectation to shocked disbelief as she realized the implications of the document. Erica's smile faded as she understood that the money they'd been counting on had already been spent on my priorities rather than hers. "You bought a cabin?" Linda's voice cracked with disbelief as she stared at the property deed. "When? How? We thought you were saving money for the family investment." The word family came out as an accusation, as if my decision to spend my own money on my own dreams was somehow a betrayal of sacred obligations I'd never agreed to accept. Martin snatched the document from her hands, studying it as if intensive examination might change the facts printed there. $280,000, he read aloud, his voice heavy with the realization that Erica's Vineyard rescue had just become impossible. "This is the money that was supposed to save the Vineyard. You can't just spend family money on personal luxuries." "It's not family money," I replied calmly, surprised by how steady my voice sounded despite the anger radiating from 3 pairs of eyes across the table. "It's my money, earned through my business, saved through my sacrifices, and spent on my decision. Just like all the money I've given Erica over the years was my money, spent on her decisions." Erica's carefully constructed composure finally cracked as the reality of her situation hit her. But what about the vineyard? What about the permits I applied for? I already told the contractors to expect funding this week. Her voice rose with the panic of someone who'd been spending money she didn't have based on promises she'd never confirmed. You can't just abandon the family business when we need you most. I'm not abandoning anything, I said, gathering the deed and placing it back in my envelope. I'm choosing my own life instead of funding yours. The vineyard was never a family business. It was Erica's project that became my responsibility without my consent. The silence that followed was dense, with 15 years of unspoken resentment finally finding its voice. The confrontation that followed was everything I'd imagined and dreaded for years. Martin accused me of selfishness. Linda questioned my loyalty to family values, and Erica dissolved into tears over the unfairness of being held responsible for her own business decisions. But their anger couldn't touch me because I'd finally stopped caring about their approval. The cabin deed in my hands represented freedom from their cycle of crisis and expectation, and no amount of guilt or manipulation could make me surrender that independence. You've always been jealous of Erica, Linda declared, playing the card she'd used to dismiss my concerns for decades. This is your way of punishing her for being successful and creative while you're stuck in boring accounting work. The accusation might have stung once, but now it simply revealed how completely my mother misunderstood both of her daughters. Erica wasn't successful. She was subsidized. And my accounting work wasn't boring. It was profitable enough to buy 40 acres of freedom. I'm not punishing anyone, I said, standing to leave before their emotional manipulation could gain momentum. I'm simply refusing to fund another one of Erica's failures. The vineyard lost money because she made poor decisions, not because she lacked adequate investment. More money won't fix problems that stem from incompetence and lack of planning. As I walked toward the door, I could hear Erica's voice rising behind me, asking who would tell the neighbors about the changed plans and how she would explain the project's cancellation to people who were expecting vineyard tours and wine tastings. For the first time in 15 years, those problems belonged entirely to her. I pulled out of the driveway feeling lighter than I had since childhood, finally free from the weight of other people's expectations and my own misplaced sense of obligation. Martin, Linda, and Erica faced immediate social humiliation when word spread throughout Spokane that the promised vineyard revival had collapsed due to their presumptuous announcement of funding they'd never secured. Neighbors who had planned harvest festivals around the renovation timeline felt deceived by the family's overconfident promises, while local business owners who had expected tourist traffic from the winery expressed disappointment at being misled about the project's viability. Erica was forced to file for bankruptcy when creditors realized no family bailout was forthcoming, and the vineyard property was eventually seized and sold at auction for a fraction of what Martin and Linda had originally paid. Their reputation in the community never recovered from the embarrassing revelation that they had committed their older daughter's money without her knowledge or consent, making them appear manipulative and dishonest to people who had respected their family for decades. The beautiful mountain cabin became my sanctuary, a place where I could pursue landscape architecture projects, while consulting remotely for clients who valued my expertise without expecting me to sacrifice my own goals for their success. As I watched the sunrise paint the Columbia River Valley in shades of gold each morning, I understood that my years of financial servitude to my family's dysfunction had taught me the most valuable lesson of all. The word no isn't selfish when it protects your right to choose your own happiness, and sometimes the greatest act of family loyalty is refusing to enable the very behaviors that are destroying the people you love.